Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's difficult conversation. The topic for today is why the majority doesn't always rule and how America's political system can thwart the will of the people. I'm joined, as always, with my co-host, Dewitt Scott, student support specialist. How's it going, Dewitt?
It's great. It's great. How about yourself?
Doing well, thanks. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too.
Um, Thank you for those who are attending. We are recording this event to share with people to watch after who weren't able to attend the virtual event live. We will have plenty of opportunity today. These conversations are designed to be interactive with participants. So there's a couple of different ways that you can contribute to our conversation, and that is through the chat or the Q&A, whatever is easiest. And if you prefer, we can keep you anonymous or username, whatever you prefer. So, this is kind of a time, this is a topic that I think many people think about. And that is, sometimes you see public opinion polls and um, a large majority of Americans may prefer a particular policy, but it doesn't get enacted. It's not something that becomes a law. It's not something that Congress is able to pass. And one that comes to mind, I think, when I think of this topic, it's generally regarding the topic of gun control, but in particular, universal background checks, which, according to many different surveys, polls have indicated about 90% of Americans support universal background checks, yet legislation has stalled out multiple times throughout the past decade. In particular, I'm thinking of when it stalled out, I want to say, I'm trying to get the year right, around 2014, where there was 55 members of the Senate who were supportive of universal background checks, and it failed to get the 60 vote threshold, which is required to end a filibuster in the Senate. And so, despite having majority support, even in the Senate, and approximately 90% of support amongst American citizens, it was unable to go forward in the Senate. And so that's kind of partly why I structured this topic with how the political system can thwart the will of the people. That, I'm a political science professor. I'm also the democracy commitment coordinator. And as a political science professor, I often cover my American government class in when we cover the Constitution to kind of think through the eyes of the framers of the Constitution that what they created was a system that would make it really hard to get anything done quickly or comprehensively. They wanted a limited government, not necessarily an effective government. And that's something that we generally regard as a parliamentary system that takes the legislative and executive and fuses them together, whereas we have separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and all of these structures were created to make it hard to get things done quickly and comprehensively, and would require, a strong consensus, to put it mildly. A bill, if you don't know, has to go through an equal form in both the House and the Senate, and then be signed by the president, and then in some cases can be overturned, ruled unconstitutional years later by the Supreme Court. So it's a pretty unique structure. And so that's my kind of first take of how our system is structured. And then I had briefly mentioned the Senate's filibuster mechanism that makes it even harder to get things passed through just that one chamber. So I'll turn it over to my co-host, DeWitt, and see what kind of thoughts you have on this topic before we open it up to the group.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think the particular issue that you brought up about gun control is one that is constant and recurring. The idea that on the surface it sounds like something that the majority of people would be okay with, even if that people differ to the degree or exactly the vehicle of how to get there. on paper, on the surface, you would think, or we could agree that the majority of people would want to legislate to some degree for gun control. And we hear that call every time there's a national tragic event that is of a large number of people who, many of them just bystanders, and they are injured or unfortunately killed in a situation where there's a I don't want to say gunman, gun person who has committed an act against a group of people. Uh, when thinking about that, also makes me think about other ways in which the subtitle of our topic, thwarting the will of the people, other laws or other not laws, but other ways in which um, things on paper sound great, but then they just don't go through. So, for instance, the idea of allowing or making it easier for the American public to vote, right? It's something that you would think if you're having conversations with everyday people on the street, who understand the importance of voting, and you said, "Hey, well, let's do what we can to allow people to vote, whether it's to give them time off from work, make it a national holiday, make it easier to vote, or, let's not restrict voting, regardless of what your political beliefs may be." But then it's something that always never really materializes when it comes to policy, right? And some places there's full-blown arguments that it's becoming even more difficult for people to vote, right? The polling places are not open as long. People are not allowed to um, converse with other people while they're standing in line. All these other things that they just seem counterintuitive when you think about a democracy or a well-run country. So those sort of thoughts are things that I want to get into in having this conversation, right? Why are these things happening? Although the majority of people you believe um, would agree with making these changes, but they're just not happening, um, because that pretty much goes against the whole idea of a government for people. It sounds like it's a government for a minority. Um, but that's just one of the things that come to mind when I think about this particular topic. Kevin, you're on mute.
Thank you. I trying to make uh, when I'm drinking tea and so forth, trying to make sure that it doesn't disrupt you. But I just wanted to chime in on a couple topics there, and I want to remind our viewers, listeners, if you will, that feel free. Any questions that you have, you can use the chat or the Q&A. A couple things that you just mentioned that I wanted to respond to. I even remember when Donald Trump was president, there was a couple, I want to say there was a mass shooting in Ohio and Texas, and he had a tweet, something to the effect of Republicans and Democrats need to come together to get strong background checks, perhaps marrying this legislation with desperately needed immigration reform. And according to there was an Atlantic article on this, and apparently Wayne LaPierre, the National Rifle Association president, had called the president and basically said that the NRA was not going to be supportive of that. And I use the National Rifle Association as one example of an interest group that often is very effective of getting its way with policy. And again, despite there being pretty strong support for various types of gun restrictions. And, a lot of times we frame this in political science jargon with elite theory, the idea that the groups with the most resources, the most money, most vocal supporters are more likely to get what they want policy-wise. In the case of the National Rifle Association, it's often just preventing against new kind of gun restrictions. So that's one example I thought of. And then the other one, and this is, to kind of play devil's advocate, not saying this is completely my opinion here, but one could argue that the framers also really didn't have democracy in mind when they were creating the Constitution, and they weren't trying to think of like, what's the best way to structure and funnel a bunch of power from the people, or to ensure that the people have a lot of power.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of ways, I think there was a lot of mechanisms that they designed to kind of thwart the will of the people. And so I'm not sure that the framers really envisioned a model of public opinion influencing public policy, perhaps the way that you and I kind of framed it at the beginning of that, or the way that I framed it at the beginning of this. If for those of you who don't remember, or just to kind of put it in clear terms, at the time of the Constitution, really only wealthy white males could vote. They could only directly vote for, at the national level, House of Representatives every 2 years. The senators were selected by state legislatures. The president was selected by the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court is nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. So really, these wealthy white males could only vote for the House of Representatives every 2 years. So they limited who could vote, they limited who you could vote for, and then elections are staggered. 2 years, every 2 years for House of Representatives, every 6 years for Senate, every 4 years for president, and then of course lifetime appointment for the Supreme Court. So they really made it hard for there to be any sort of significant change with even elected officials. And with one could cite a lot of examples of how the framers didn't really have a positive view of the public, or the idea of like public opinion, or the citizens being very informed, and whether they should be consulted
Yeah.
on kind of complex policy issues. And just to play that devil's advocate a bit further, one might say, and even today's society, that despite being more informed, despite having a more positive view that the citizens should be more consulted, if you will, in making policy, that we're still pretty uninformed on a lot of complex technical issues, and perhaps it's not the best system to just consult the average Joe or Sally American and take their views on what we should be doing on trade and going to war and so forth. That perhaps it might be better to have technocrats, people with a lot of experience, qualifications, education, who are making these really complicated policy decisions. So just food for thought, and interested if there's any feedback on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, particularly when you're talking about an informed citizenry, which, I mean, that's a term that we hear a lot when talking about what the goals of America are, what the goals of the educational system is in America, right? You have plenty of local and higher education institutions that say our goal is to produce an informed citizenry. But as you said, if we're going to be honest and we're going to walk down the street, we're going to walk down LaGrange, or we're going to walk down 111th Street, and we ask, every person that we see just about the basic beginners questions regarding trade agreements, regarding the political process, regarding just all of these things that will fall under that umbrella, and the majority of them really won't have just even a basic understanding. And I understand that a lot of people, they're busy, they're raising their families, they're working, they're trying to make ends meet, they're going through their everyday lives. They don't necessarily have the time and opportunity to study everything. And I can see how that leads to the idea of what you said of having technocrats and educated people, or um, qualified people to sort of make those decisions for them. Um, the the other side of that is then you can have politicians who pretty much run amok. All right, they're making decisions that they claim are for represent the areas that they are leading, or that the people voted for them, when they really understand that the majority of people who voted for them don't understand exactly what the politician is going to push for, and to just trust that person, usually a man, but trust men, women, whomever, to make that decision. And that becomes dangerous. That really becomes dangerous. And it's connected to so many other threads. I don't want to go too far on a tangent here, but the idea of, okay, well, how do these people become in power? And another policy that sounds great on the surface is that we should have some sort of way to limit how much people can donate to a political campaign, right? Because if you have these political campaigns set up the way they are now, usually the people with the um, largest amount of money, they have a better chance of winning, right? Now, they're not always guaranteed, but they have a better chance of winning. But that already out the gate just sets an uneven bar, or uneven playing field, because now it's about who can raise the most money. Um, and once you get there, now, okay, you've received this donor money, you've essentially been bought in many ways because now you have to appease the donor. Um, so the average person would say, yeah, that sounds unfair on the surface. We should have some sort of way to limit that, whether it's a limit on donors, whether it's no more using donors, period, use public dollars, whatever. But it's a policy that, in my eyes, you correct me if I'm wrong, I just don't see that even becoming a topic of discussion to even change anytime soon, because that could really just upend the entire political system. Um, but to your point about the original makers of the Constitution, I agree. I don't think that they have much faith in the intellectual possibilities of the public. I still think today's politicians feel the same way. They know that and they act accordingly. They get voted into office and they act accordingly, and I think that's a problem. But you know,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. A few points that come to mind. So if we look at our elected, so one quick summary of my interpretation of what you said was about there's a lot of anti-democratic features in our system. The role of money in our campaigns, that in and of itself is going to limit a lot of potential candidates, a lot of potentially qualified candidates, because either they're not uh, they don't have a lot of money themselves, or they're not able to attract a lot of the right type of donors who do have deep pockets. And I don't think you have to look too much further than our own state to look at our recent governor candidates or current governor, and we've had the last two governors have are essentially billionaires, if I'm correct, if I'm not mistaken. And another way of kind of just looking at who represents us, just thinking about the demographics of whether it's our current Congress, or historically looking through the years of, what percentage of our elected officials are, white males in particular. So, I think even today we're just over 20% of our members of Congress that are female. We're having, I think as we speak, Senate hearings with Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Jackson Brown, and who, as we know, would be the first Black female to be in the Supreme Court after 230 plus years. So there's a lot of ways that, and I was thinking about even our the House of Representative, who I think had represented the district around Marine Valley up until 2018, was Dan Lipinski. And I used to use him as an example when you were talking about we call it the idea of a trustee, that we elect. There's a couple different models. The idea of a trustee is that the elected official, in this case Dan Lipinski, knows best. And I would use that as an example because he literally had a PhD in political science. He used to teach political science at, I think, the University of Tennessee. He has a lot of broad knowledge of government and politics. He had over a decade of experience as a House of Representative, and before that, he was preceded by his father, who represented the same district for 20 years, essentially the same district. So it's kind of in the family business, if you will. So the idea of, like, when we're making, you said, going down LaGrange Avenue and trying to find people and consulting them, hey, should we have a no-fly zone in Ukraine? Can they even find Ukraine on a map? Do they know what a no-fly zone entails, of potentially having to shoot missile systems down inside of Russia, that we would have to patrol them inside of Ukraine with our own jets, and what happens if our jets? So there's just a lot of complicated aspects to this. Is it better to have somebody like Dan Lipinski with all of that technical experience, background experience, versus the other model, which is the delegate theory, and that is the representative simply just takes our spot, that ideally we would be making these decisions ourselves. They are elected by us, and they should essentially do what we would like them to do, so essentially following public opinion. So that came to mind. And then when you were talking about money in politics, I think of how we have tried to pass laws. We actually have passed laws to limit the role of money in campaigns and elections. And, I was mentioning earlier the role of the Supreme Court to potentially overturn legislation that was passed by the House, the Senate, and signed into law by the president. And that's essentially what Citizens United did, with allowing essentially unlimited money from corporations and unions, which was opposed to what had passed through Congress and what the majority of the public supported. So I've talked a lot. I'm hoping to get to, I was not necessarily stalling, but hoping to get some questions from the audience. We've got a good group of people here today. So one question that came up in the chat said, sorry if I addressed this earlier, but what about the Supreme Court? 5 of the 9 were appointed by presidents who didn't win the popular vote. There are 14 Supreme Court justices in history that they're able to find. And I think that's an excellent point that was raised by Professor McCauley, that we, of course, 3 Supreme Court members were nominated. So a third of the Supreme Court was nominated by former President Trump. And of course, President Trump had lost the popular vote in 2016. And then George Bush had lost the popular vote in 2000, and he nominated 2 members of the Supreme Court. I want to say one of them was after he won in 2004, where he did win the popular vote, but the point still holds. He wouldn't have been president in 2000 had he lost the popular vote. And really, to be fair, the Republicans have won the popular vote 1 time since 1988. So in 1992, 96, 2000. So yeah, 2000, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, Democrats have won the popular vote in all of those elections, except for 2004, going back to 1988. But yet 6 of the 9 members of the Supreme Court are conservative, nominated by Republican presidents. So here we have an institution that is, of those 5 of those 9 members are also going to be around for quite some time. I know the 3 members that Donald Trump had appointed were all in their early 50s. So hypothetically, we've got 3 more decades of those Supreme Court members who were nominated by a president who didn't win the popular vote. And I think there's a lot of similar arguments one could look at with the Senate, that, right now we have a 50-50 Senate, but if you look at the states breakdown, the Democrats represent something like 40 million more people, despite having the same number of senators, because they represent, for the most part, states like California and Illinois, New York, that are more populous. There are a couple examples for Republicans, but Texas and Florida. But overall, if you look at the number of senators in the state that they represent, there's definitely, fewer percentage of people represented by Republicans in the Senate as well. So it's a real question, about another anti-democratic feature. And I think, of course, we could go through a lot of really pivotal decisions that the Supreme Court makes, and the long-term implications that it has. And so I think when, DeWitt was probably thinking of this topic in a little bit different way than I framed it at the beginning, and that is with all of these anti-democratic features embedded in our system. And so I would put it back to the audience and see, like, what kind of, what are your thoughts on that? Like, I'm happy to give my own, but I think you can probably pick up on it a little bit already of what my opinion is on that. DeWitt, well, how about to you?
Well, I think Jeff brings up a great question. And I would like to tie his question and your statement, your response to his question, to something that I tend to hear often, particularly from younger people. And when I say younger people, I mean an electorate between the age of like 18 and 30, right? So I think, I have no data to back it up, but I think from people that I talk to that many younger people today are losing faith in the political process. Right? they are asking the question of why do I need to vote? It doesn't matter, right? Because uh, my vote, while I'm told it would count, it won't count, right? And obviously, we could talk about things like the electoral college and the way that works and everything. But I think with younger people who, again, may not know all of the details of how everything works, they hear a statement like you said about the popular vote being going in one direction, but then there is the electoral college that steps in who makes a decision. And then the idea is, well, why did I vote? Right? Why did I vote? And then connected to the statement that I made earlier, it seems that in many places it's becoming harder to vote. Right. So my in my mind, I'll question to you and anyone else that wants to chime in, what if everyone was allowed to vote, right? What if, I mean, everyone 18 and over, regardless if you are incarcerated, regardless of your particular background, where you live, or what, if there was no restrictions, if we made it a national holiday, no one had to work, free holiday, and there was, I mean, whether you were mail-in vote, whether you were coming in person, whatever it was, what if everyone was given an actual opportunity to vote? What it sounds like is that even with the limits that we have now, there's one particular party that wins the majority of the time, like you said, since 1988. So then the idea would be if everyone's allowed to vote, it seems like that same party would win almost every single election all the time, right? So, yeah, I'm interested to get your opinion, Kevin. It sounds like the majority of Americans would vote Democrat, right? Now we have a discussion about if they understand what what the implications of being a Democrat mean, and are they really informed and everything. But it just sounds like the majority of America would vote Democrat, and it sounds like if you're not a Democrat, you're very scared of that idea. So you do what you can, whether subtly or overtly, put to not allow that to happen, right? I'm interested to see what you think about that because I know you're much more informed about this than I am.
Well, it was a big topic of my class discussion today because we are covering it's a chapter on voting in elections, and we're looking at statewide efforts eh, to make it harder to vote. So there's been a huge um, divide between blue states and red states. Blue states that are vote Democrat in presidential elections and that are controlled by either Democratic governor, Democratic state legislature. And we've seen states that are blue, like Illinois, that have allowed same-day voter registration, that have don't require a photo ID to vote, and essentially are much easier to vote. A great example is Oregon. They have universal mail-in voting. You don't have to register to vote. So they're kind of at one end, and then you have at the other end, you've got states like Mississippi, and frankly, a lot of the states in the deep South where it's much more restrictive, where you do have to have a photo ID. There is, very limited or no early voting, depending upon some of these states. No absentee voting, and so much more restrictive environment. And what we've seen in the last, just in the last year or two, since the year and a half since the 2020 election, is many Republican states go much further in their restrictions. And I'm happy to talk about the examples of those, but off the top of my head, again, limiting early voting. You talked about reducing the length of the voting time on election day, and that's been an example is in Iowa. And the idea of why they're doing this is because there's perception amongst the voters, amongst the citizens, that there's election fraud, that there's widespread fraud, and these new restrictive measures are necessary to prevent that type of fraud. But there was actually an excellent article in the New York Times on this. The state legislator in Iowa who had proposed this legislation couldn't identify a single example of any fraud that would justify these new restrictive measures. But he went on to cite that it's just the perception amongst the voters is that there is fraud. And there was 18 other states that had done this similar, according to the New York Times study, had found that there was 18 other states who similarly cited public opinion that was suggesting that there was election fraud, of why they were supportive of new restrictive measures. And so I'm thinking of places like what all this means when you reduce early voting, when you limit absentee balloting, and you reduce the time of election day, then the lines are much longer. And you can do a Google search and look at minorities, in particular Black Americans, of how much longer they have to wait in lines, because our elections are decentralized, and so we don't have a universal experience when we go to vote. Our local polling place that I might go to might be well staffed, and might allow for a lot of early voting and absentee voting. And so when I go to vote, I walk right in and there's lots of polling booths and it's really easy, go in and vote and I leave. Whereas, I can show examples in parts of Georgia where there was 8 to 10 hour long lines. And so some groups brought bottled water and food to those who were waiting 8 hours in line, because one would think you'd be hungry and thirsty. And so now it's illegal in Georgia, because of these new restrictive laws, to bring food or water to those who are waiting in line. And that's just one example of what's going on. And so to your point, DeWitt, I think, yes, the idea of more people voting generally is going to benefit Democrats, and the evidence I have for that is there's about a 20% gap between presidential election turnout and non-presidential election turnout. So in 2020, I think the voter turnout was just over 60%, 65%. And so when you have this upcoming election in 2022, it's a non-presidential election. It generally has 20% lower voter turnout, so around 40, 45%. And that's generally, the difference is largely Democratic voters, typically younger voters who skew 18 to 29-year-olds who generally support Democrats, anywhere from 60 to 67% of those voters are going to vote Democrat. Often minority voters who are anywhere from 67 to 90% likely to vote for Democrats are less likely to vote in non-presidential elections. So I think that's a fair assessment that if everyone voted, if there was universal voting like you'd see in places like Australia and Argentina where it's compulsory to vote, the likelihood that Democrats would do much better at the polls. And a cynic on the left might say that that's a big reason why we've seen so many restrictive voting measures across Republican-led states, is to try to limit Democratic-leaning voters. I want to say off the top of my head that just when it comes to photo ID, that 87% of whites have a photo ID, 77% of Hispanics, and around upper 60s or low 70s of Black Americans have a photo ID. And so if you have requirement of a photo ID, you can see right there that it's going to have a disproportionate impact on minorities compared to whites. So again, I went perhaps way longer than I needed to, but happy to talk more. Obviously, I have a lot to say on the topic. I see that some's coming up in the chat as well. So a couple different comments. Before I get to those, DeWitt, did you want to add anything before I get to the chat comments?
No, actually, I have some ideas, but I can hold my ideas. They can wait until we get the feed the participation from those who are watching.
The idea that a minority of conservative-leaning policymakers or voters could usurp control of elections and who can vote and what the results will actually be presented, that if the vote does not turn out the way a certain party wants it to be, they will have the power to overturn the will of the people, is terrifying. Yeah, and this, if the if what we're saying is true, that restrictive voting measures are disproportionately going to help Republicans, and there's strong evidence for this, then of course the states, and there's a majority of the states that are doing this, those states are likely going to elect Republican senators, Republican House of Representatives, and then of course at the state level too. And then, you have the power to make legislation that is further assisting your own party prerogatives that might be restricting voting, restricted voting measures, or thwarting. There's the John Lewis bill. John Lewis, if you don't know, is a civil rights icon, and there was an effort by Democrats to have national legislation that would try to limit some of these restrictive measures that have been going on at the state level, to have kind of an added universal protection for all citizens, regardless of what state you live in, essentially to kind of overturn the effect of states like Mississippi, making it harder to vote. And, you can look up the bill that's been proposed, but, the reason I don't think we need to go into too much more detail about it is it's likely, it's been blocked in part by Republican senators, but also even by some moderate Democrats. It could pass if it had the support of Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kristen Sinema, two Democrat. She's from Arizona, and they have not been supportive of this either. So I think it is a concerning trend that I think the way I label this to my students is, certainly I have a personal opinion on this, but historically, well, the recent history, this hasn't been that partisan of an issue. I think if you go back 20 to 30 years, at least in that time window, this wasn't such a partisan issue. These restrictive voting measures have become so really in the last 10 to 15 years. And so, and the other point that I would make is that generally, I think voting is a hallmark of a democratic type system, and the more voting, the better. Like, that is not to say that, you cheat and you vote multiple times. That is to say, just higher voter turnout. And when the United States is lagging the rest of the advanced democracies in voter turnout, I don't see that as a healthy sign for a democracy. So I generally think voting should be easier. I don't, having it on a Tuesday in November, which is historically cold for much of the United States, is really a relic of the past. And many other countries have a national holiday. Again, at the state level, states like Illinois are moving in a more open manner, where we have now recently passed where Election Day is a state holiday. But just thinking nationally how you can make voter turnout higher, I think those are generally good things, irrespective of which particular party it's going to help or hurt. I think the more citizens can participate in their system, the better.
So with that, Kevin, I would agree. So I'm trying to think of ways in which we could flip the conversation, right? Because I said it before in our conversations in the past. I consider myself left of left, right? So it's very easy to see where I land in these on the spectrum when it comes to these sort of discussions, right? So in order to keep in line with our theme of difficult conversations, and I would welcome anyone who considers themselves not left of left, or left at all. But I guess I'm trying my best to put myself in these shoes, and I may do a good job, may not. But what if I am the person who is of the far right, and I say, yes, I hear everything that you're saying, and I disagree with it, right? The idea that these restrictions and these things are being put in place. We talked about the Second Amendment and um, gun control every time there is a mass shooting, right? Yes, the people may want this, and this is what they may push for. But as someone who is on the far right, I am of the belief that the values of the left are the values that are tearing down this country. the country was better at this time, right? The country was better in 1800s, early 1900s, or whatever you want to say, right? The whole idea behind "Make America Great Again" implies that it was great at some point, and now all of these values that are coming from the left, right? Take away my guns, would destroy the country. Same-sex marriage would destroy the country. Um, Single-payer healthcare system would destroy the country. Free public education would destroy the country. Um, Abortions, when people want to have abortions, will destroy the country. So the majority of the country wants these things, but these are all bad things. So it will take a quote unquote minority of right wing people, Republican people, whomever, to show leadership and to show this God driven, this religious, ordained by God sort of approach in order for us to get us on the right track as a country. You may disagree now, but this is for the better of the long term for our country, for our children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. What would you say? Um, what would you say in response to that particular argument?
Well, I'm going to focus more on the first part, and feel free to push me and force me to respond to whatever I left out. But one of the first notes that I made when you were thinking, I'd go back to my devil's advocate position, which is a little bit of a cop out. I think there's an actual case. So going back to the universal background checks, one could argue like you're never going to make universal sounds good. And what I would say is when you ask many public opinion poll questions, they're worded in a way that's going to lead you to a particularly desired response. So universal background checks, especially after mass shootings, sound really good. And I want to say that was 2015. I think it was after the Newtown shooting. It wouldn't have stopped Adam Lanza from, who was mentally not well, from grabbing his mother's gun that was legally purchased. And I could, Dewitt, if when your little ones get older, you could sell or give your guns to your little ones if you own them. And so a lot of private sales, family member to family member, don't require background checks, and I don't know how you ever will have universal background checks in that sense. And so it's back to that point that I was trying to raise earlier, that I don't know that it's always good to use public opinion as the primary and exclusive source for making legislation. I think that it can be ill-informed, and so I think that whether it's on the right or the left, I think there's valid arguments that we shouldn't necessarily just consult majority rule. And I do think that the framers thought that having the institutions that they created, they were more concerned about thwarting, having a tyrant, having tyranny. And for the most part in our history, they've done those institutions have done very well at impeding a tyranny. And so they weren't really as concerned about having the effective government. And so I think that it's well designed for if you're looking at those values. I felt like there was another point that I wanted to raise about concerns on the right. So what parts did I leave out? I'm not trying to avoid.
No. So you addressed the gun legislation, but essentially the broader point was that the leftist values are very slowly, gradually destroying the fabric of our country, right? The CRT in the classroom making white kids feel, this is the argument, making white kids feel guilty about slavery, allowing LGBTQ agendas to proliferate throughout schools, right? And there's always these extreme examples, right? The idea of someone on the right, and again, I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone on the right. So if there's someone who's watching who can do this much better, I'd appreciate it. But the idea that I don't want my 4-year-old son who's in pre-K to be taught about LGBTQ issues because that is an agenda that is being pushed by someone who's an enemy of me. Um, in this whole idea, and this is why, as a far right person who I agree may be in the minority when it comes to the political numbers, we have to take this leadership role, because if we don't, the left will send us to hell in the handbasket. Right? That's just a broader point I was trying to say.
Yeah, and I didn't directly address that. I think implicit in my response is that these institutions and having the structure that we created is going to be an impediment to like the whims and moment, like the public opinion of the day. Like it's gonna it take. When I was mentioning about the staggered elections, even today when we can vote for our senator and House of Representative, and somewhat directly our president, but still through the Electoral College, it's a full 6 years before you would be able to get that full cycle at the national level. And so I think that in part there's embedded in our system is the idea that we're not always going to use that public opinion of the day, whatever issue it is, isn't going to dramatically affect government at any given point. I think that there is from time to time opinion that is popular that isn't always right. I mean, clearly, had there been public opinion polls in the late 1700s, early 1800s, probably slavery would have been majority of people supported it. I think that at least in parts of the United States, that segregation would have been perhaps popular in some of the southern states, and so we could probably give plenty of examples where public opinion may have been over 50% threshold, so a majority, but it wasn't moral or ethical for that public opinion to be used to influence policy. So similarly today, there could be plenty of examples to where just because a majority of the people support something doesn't mean that it is either an effective or just policy. And so leaders or the system shouldn't necessarily bend to that majority rural concept for those reasons alone. And again, I'm not trying to completely avoid the specific topics that you brought up, but just kind of providing that more broad framework that, I think if you're on the right, that would give credit, like support of why policies, just because they have a majority support, shouldn't necessarily be enacted or be directing us.
Hmm. No, I understand clearly what you're saying. And I think what you're saying is important and correct. I just think about it from, again, a side that I am not familiar with personally, because that's what I try to do from time to time is understand the other side and why are we limiting the vote? Why are we pushing in certain ways to enact these laws or these policies that are against what I believe are the majority of the people. And the only thing I can come up with is that that side that wants these sort of policies and laws in place, they just believe that their opponents are misguided. They misunderstand, they don't know, and they're going to ruin our country. They're going to make it hard for my great grandchildren um, to succeed. And I can't have that in 2022. I can't have that. So I have to make sure that I restrict access to abortions, or I have to, as you talked about before, you can't pass out water in lines when it's time to vote. I have to do what I have to do in order to make sure that this country goes to the proper place that it's supposed to go. Because right now I'm afraid of where it's going because everything seems so liberal, and some other agendas being pushed. But I think your response is valid. I think you did address that particular point.
Well, and I thought of three other related points to that. One, I think on the right, it's pretty pervasive that the idea of getting a photo ID, that most people, we just cited, you know, whites, Hispanics, and blacks, a vast majority do have a photo ID. And I think the perception on the right is that it's not that onerous to get a photo ID. And if that you want to vote, then it's partly a privilege that you need to, it's not too onerous for you to do a few basic steps. And so my response to that is that a photo ID does cost upwards of $30 depending upon the state that you live in, for a state ID, and you have to get to the DMV. Some people have public transportation as the only way to get there, and sometimes the hours don't match up with when you're able to get there. Um, but I think that there could be some general agreement that if they were provided for free and issued by the state or national government like they are in other countries, that that could be a way to kind of assuage some of the fears on the right that there's voter impersonation or other types of fraud that could easily be rectified through something like that. I do think at a broader level, in the last few decades, there's been significant changes in America, and I think this is certainly something animating our politics. If you know, as just one example, demographically, the percentage of whites in the United States has been declining over the years and is projected to be no majority population by race ethnicity by perhaps as early as 2040. And so I think that that's partly, you know, I don't know how you want to frame it in the background or in the foreground, but it's something that I think is definitely relevant to this conversation. And I think that there's a mindset that some of those issues you just talked about and some of the other just significant changes that we've had in the last decade or two, society wise, technology wise, job industry wise, and so forth, that it just can't possibly be that Democrats are really winning. And so there must be something, and it must be fraud. And so, and perhaps with the advent of social media, it's easier to spread these examples of, well, this person was mailed more than one ballot, or, you know, the scale of mail-in voting in 2020 because of the pandemic was dramatically different than in the past. And it just, I think there's just a perception that something must be off.
Yeah.
And, you know, I can't directly fix that with any sort of argument with saying, well, you know, the cybersecurity federal agency that oversees national elections said 2020 was the most secure election in U.S. history. And, you know, at least 11 different Trump advisors had told him after the 2020 election that there was no systematic fraud that in any way impacted the outcome in Arizona, in Wisconsin, in Georgia. So, you know, it, I don't, I don't really know how to fully answer that other than saying, you know, that I don't believe that there's widespread fraud that overturns the outcome of elections. I do
Hmm.
know that our last two presidential elections were really, really close. You
Hmm.
know, Joe Biden would have lost had just about 42 or 45,000 votes gone differently in those three states that I just mentioned.
Hmm.
So I think when you're having, you know, 160 million plus Americans vote and it's determined by that small percentage, it might be easy for people to think about how, you know, on the margins, how elections could be altered by just a few thousand people.
That's a good point. Good point. Fair point. Right. I, I would have to agree. So I don't know if you have any other questions in the chat. I don't see any on my
Yeah,
end.
just I think that that idea that the good old days were always good and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems, that there's a segment of the population, perhaps more on the right, that sees their way of life being threatened by more tolerant attitudes. And, you know, that's essentially what I was abstractly referring to. And let me just give a few examples that, you know, within the last decade, same-sex marriage has been legalized. I listened to part of the Senate hearings today with Justice Judge Ketanji Jackson Brown, and this came up a lot with Senator Corrin, where he's, you know, really saying like, hey, a lot of Americans have very religious beliefs on a traditional marriage between one man and one woman, and this is a you know, a newer change in our society that now acknowledges and respects and provides same-sex couples the right to marry. But for many Americans, not putting a number on it, it's still a significant departure from perhaps their religious beliefs and their traditional ways that they thought marriage was defined as. There's, transgender bathroom issue, I think, is one that has animated certain parts of the population.
Mhm.
I know in the latter part of the Obama administration, there was two different executive orders dealing with unauthorized immigrants into the United States, DACA, and then the parents of DACA. So kids who were brought here by their parents into the United States, and then kids who would be under the age of 18 having their parents get deferred deportation. And both of those were essentially challenged and upheld by 26 conservative states led by Texas. And so what I would say is that there has been significant change. And I would say all of those issues I can provide without, my own political leanings aside. I think that there's logical equal treatment under the law arguments for each one of those examples that I brought up, or with the case of yeah, DACA, it's really kind of a morality issue too. There's a lot of different arguments one can bring up about kids who don't know any other home than the United States, in having to move them to some country that they don't even remember. So that, those are just three examples, but that's pretty significant change that occurred in relatively 5-year time window. And I think that that's perhaps animated people on the right to, and you mentioned, CRT and other issues that I think really came out after the murder of George Floyd and the protests. And I think many institutions, education being one of them, really doing a deep reflection and thinking, how how can we be better and how can we make our people better, and making sure that we're not perpetuating problems. And so there was probably, well, I know there's a lot of trainings going on at higher education at K through 12 amongst teachers. And I think there's some of those trainings or aspects and cherry picking that goes on that people think is too far. So I do think that, I don't want to say that I don't fully agree. I don't agree with the stance on the right on those particular issues that I just mentioned, but I think that one can empathize and say that there's certainly been some significant change. I would just say that, when cases are brought to the court system, they have to adhere to the law. And, as far as the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law, I think there's a strong case there.
Yes, I would agree. And I agree. I agree with your statement about the progress in recent years in such a short amount of time, and I agree with I call it fear from those who oppose those views to say, hey, things are changing pretty rapidly, and if I'm not careful, my entire way of life or the way that I see things will be totally revamped, and then what? So I do think that is at the core of it, and I agree. Sometimes though, when you're living in it, you don't always see it. I think you explained it very well how those three major things that you mentioned have pretty much happened in the past 5 to 6 years. It doesn't feel that way when you're living through it, but when you take the time to sort of step back and reflect on it and study it, you do realize that it is pretty quick. And as we know from a political standpoint, 5 years is nothing, right? 5 years is
Yeah.
nothing. So with that sort of momentum sort of being built, I can see a concern from anyone on who sees the world differently.
So we're down to our final minute or so, and we're always happy to go over if we need, but I wanted to throw back to the audience and see if there's any um, final questions or comments. And to you, DeWitt, if any thoughts that we didn't get to that you may have had.
No, I think we covered much of it. And I'm just going on things that I hear people say. Again, usually younger people with the 18 to 30 crowd. The whole idea when it comes to the political process, why are there only two dominant parties, right? Why is it there more You know what? People again who don't really understand the history of it, they feel that there are only Republicans and Democrats on the ballot, and that you have to be one or the other. And to be one is to instantly be an enemy of the other. You know, so questions around, you know, how do we get there? Um, Larger questions about what it means in terms of um, sometimes you have people, or many times you have people who are Republicans who point to the larger inner cities in America, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and talk about how these are just democratic machines, right? Democratic Party has run them for decades, and they're rampant with crime. They're rampant with poor educational institutions. They're rampant with all of these things, and you know you have the right to point to that to say this is why we push what we push for, because when you have left or liberal led areas, you have poverty, you have crime, you have murder, you have decay, you know, and just some of the things that sort of coordinated with those things. But um, you know, we don't have 5 hours to sort of break down every single detail, but those are just things that I hear from time to time.
I too, I wanted to piggyback on that earlier about the lack of faith in the system that young people have, and unfortunately, I think there's some merit for that for many of the reasons that you and I had mentioned. And it's perhaps a topic for a difficult conversation to have down the road about, because I think that both the right and the left have different fears or concerns about how why they're losing faith in the system. Um, and so that could be something that we could explore down the road. But see if I can share this real quick. One idea that you just mentioned that made me think of another way of you mentioned cities, and I think that when you get down to it, a lot of the election fraud issues, you know, at least when you hear some of the leaders of the Republican Party, in particular former President Trump, it's largely when they're talking about fraud, they're not talking about fraud in rural Illinois or rural Wisconsin, right? They're talking about it being in urban areas. And one of the things I do think happens, and my students are often, so these states are colored blue and red. This is the 2020 election, and they're blue based on whether they voted for the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, or red for the Republican candidate, Donald Trump. And when you scroll over a state, and I'll just click on Illinois here, but in Illinois, if you can see this, it's Joe Biden won with 57% of the vote, and he had about a million more votes than Donald Trump. So it really wasn't close. But then, if you just look at Cook County, notice that all of his margin is this, you know, can be controlled for if you were to essentially take out Cook County, that 1 million vote advantage goes away.
Yes.
And as it happens, we're not the only state in the country that's like this, but a disproportionate percentage of our state's population lives in Cook County, the Chicago, that encompasses much of, or all of Chicago and parts of the suburbs. So that's where most of the people live. So of course, in Cook County has a disproportionate influence in um, selecting and who wins the state, and that's not all that different in some of the other areas. And when I click on Michigan, Michigan was won by about 100,000 votes, just over 150,000 votes. But you see much of the territory, much of the land, most of the counties is red. And again, when you go around some of the more heavily populated areas around Detroit, you can see that Wayne County essentially counts for all of that victory for Michigan, and I could go on, but I think you get the point. So I think there is some concerns that we could talk about how often the Democrats are winning the popular vote, but they're largely, the entire popular vote advantage can be accounted for in California alone. So Democrats run up huge advantage in some of the bigger states like California. So, I'm not saying that that's like, I understand some arguments there. I still think like, well, if we want a system to represent people. We should represent the people where they live, and
Mhm.
if they disproportionately live in urban and suburban areas, that's where they've chosen to live. And as it is, we already give disproportionate impact to these geographic entities called states, where every
Mhm.
state has at least 2 senators in one House of Representative, regardless of how small their population is. So that means states like Wyoming with 600,000 people have 2 senators, and states like California with 40 million people have 2 senators.
Mhm.
So looks like we have another comment. This country is corrupted as any other country, but doesn't dare to admit it. People in power are not held accountable. We live in a country where mass genocide occurred. I don't vote because I don't trust the people that, quote unquote, run this country. I'm nothing but an expendable number to them. Just a thought. And, I don't think your thought is alone. The only, my first takeaway though, when I read that is, um, when we give these examples like Michigan, or I'm sorry, in 2020, it was Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona. Georgia and Arizona was just over 10,000 votes each that separated this election. And,
Mhm.
granted, we're in Illinois, at least I'm in Illinois. And I think DeWitt, you live in Chicago, you're in Illinois. But if local elections and statewide elections are often really, really close. And
Yeah.
so you and your vote, and if other people share your idea, you join a group and you can maximize your power and try to say we need new types of representatives. And we've seen pretty there are examples. I'm thinking of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a former bartender, who have come to power and gained a lot of prominence. So the point I'm trying to raise is that when we get to a point in our life, we think that maybe it's time that you run. It could be something consequential like your school board, or another local race, or getting more involved. And I do, I understand the cynicism and apathy in a way, but I feel like it's healthier to try to make a change, and it gives you more, um, where you feel like you're part of the solution, where you feel like you have some agency in trying to make a change.
No, I feel similarly. I can't see the comment. It went directly to you, but so I don't know who made it. But I do understand the argument of the statement. Um, from what I remember from what you said, I feel like I'm an expendable number. I don't trust the people in power. I 100% understand it. And I see the merit in it. And in many ways, I agree. So I never really disparage anyone who doesn't vote. I vote. I vote all the time. I vote in every single election. I don't disparage anyone who doesn't vote. But for those who don't vote, I often have conversations with them because much of my family doesn't necessarily vote. And I know plenty of people in my area who just don't vote. And my argument is that's okay. As unpopular as it may sound, that's okay. But you have to do something, right? You have to do something. And people often say that, well, the reason I don't vote is because I know it won't be taken seriously. I'm only one person and it won't affect anything. So then they also say, well, I don't do much because I don't do anything because I'm only one person. What can I do? You can do something, and you have to start at that something, whatever that something is. But you have to do something, because if you just don't do anything, if you're not voting, if you're not active in any way, if you're not um, taking on any sort of movement, activism, or anything, then whomever it is that you are have the problem with, the leadership, the 1%, whomever it may be, they're winning because you're doing nothing.
Yeah.
So you have to do something. You have to organize, or you have to lend your time. It doesn't have to be money. You lend your time, your energy, your thought, your talents to something if you're not going to vote. Um, but that's I understand the sentiment.
I think with that, there's a lot of young people who have gotten involved in, maybe through their religious group, or through other non-governmental organizations, nonprofits. There's a lot of activism, maybe just not always political, like pure, joining a political party or, running for an election. So there's a lot of ways that you can get involved. And I definitely, um, would just validate everything that DeWitt just said, because I think that if it's not voting, there's other ways you can make a difference in your community. And the other part I wanted to validate was that if you don't get involved, I mean, there's this kind of idea that you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And I
Hmm.
think it's, a lot easier for special interest groups to kind of get their way. And for those of you, like there was just a comment talking about how we, the people, are supposed to be the voice. But many of our leaders ignore the real problems at hand, and what they're doing to stay against the minority. Well, that's only easier when so many of us are on the sidelines. That there's we're perpetuating a system by not participating. Yeah, and then Jan mentioned how nothing will change if we don't participate. Decisions are made by those who show up. And one of the things I've often used in my class is just showing, the group with the highest voter turnout are those who are age 60 years and older. And, you know, um, things like Social Security and Medicare that are really important to senior citizens, um, are rarely ever on the chopping block, in part because they're they call it the third rail of politics. You don't want to touch it because any elected official who would change those two popular programs amongst seniors would really face the voter backlash. And
Hmm.
um, you know, in 2003, when they passed the prescription drug benefit for Medicare, it was easily going to cost $50 billion a year back at that time, and now it's significantly more than that because we have more senior citizens who are reaching age 65 years and older who are now eligible for Medicare. So we pay, I want to say, a good 70 to $80 billion a year, off the top of my head, and that's completely appropriate, perhaps, but there's not money for, what I think a tenth of that would pay for free community college, but that money isn't there, in part because, of course, community college students in particular don't vote at the rate that senior citizens do. And that's just not trying to equate those two issues,
Uh,
but
that's
it's
a good
just a
point.
point that there's consequences to not acting or to not voting, to not participating.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I want to say also resistance can exist in a lot of different ways, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be you voting the most radical person in office. It doesn't have to be you running for office. A lot of people say, well, that's just not who I am or whatever. But I mean, resistance is you picking up the trash off your block, right? The resistance is you donating, or not donating, but volunteering your time at the nearby elementary school, right? Resistance is you, as Kevin know, I'm a big book person, right? But resistance is you going into an area that you know is not necessarily have the greatest access to literature, and you putting up a free library, right? The little small free library where you open the door and drop a book in. Like those are all things that can be done that directly affects political or politics, right? And politics beyond the Democrat Republican binary, just politics, period. Supporting businesses that sort of do the things that you are for. Um, like there's just a lot that you can do, right? And even we didn't necessarily get into this, but when we talk about the environment and being sustainable, right? And when the weather breaks in Chicago, which is only for 2 months, it's only warm here for 2 months, right? When the weather breaks, right? If you have the opportunity to ride a bike somewhere versus driving a car, because you know what a car does to the environment, right? That is resistance, right? That's resistance. That, in my opinion, you riding that bike to your family member's house or to the local wherever you to the store, that there is resistance against the people who are climate change deniers, right? That you just have. I think we need a broader perspective on what it is that we're capable of doing, because there's something that we can do every day.
I I hear you, and that made me think too of even those of us who may spend time on social media. What do you click on? What do you share? There's a lot of ways you can make a difference by what goes viral, like what you help make go viral, and
Mhm.
what do you raise awareness with your tweets or with whatever you do on social media, on issues that matter. And I think a lot of these domains are ways that really impact our society in policymaking today that is different than the past before we had some of these technologies. So even those kind of non-traditional ways of participating, I think there's ways to get involved too. I wanted to make a plug for our next. We are now in every 2 weeks we have a new difficult conversation, and the next one on April 5th is, do colleges have a problem with cancel culture, wokeism, and free speech? And as it happens, I know I've come across multiple articles just in the last 2 weeks on colleges having a free speech problem. So that's what's next. And as always, I enjoy talking to you, DeWitt, and it was great to have so much participation today from our audience, and want to thank all those who attended, and thanks for your contributions to our discussion.
Yes, thank all of you all who chimed in. Please come back to our future discussions and bring your thoughts as well, because we really enjoy reading what you post in the chat and sort of answering to it and just seeing how other people think. And Kevin, thanks for another great discussion. I always love them. And I look forward to them. They all circled on my calendar. I look forward to each of them. And today was no different. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks so much, DeWitt, and take care, everyone.